You've probably heard the term culturally responsive teaching thrown around a lot lately, especially in some pretty heated debates about education. But what does it actually mean? Seriously, let's get past all the noise and really unpack the history, the core ideas, and what it looks like in a real classroom. So, to really get this, we have to start with a really fundamental question. Why do some students feel, well, invisible at school? Why do they feel like their experiences, their families, and just who they are aren't reflected in what they're learning? That question right there is the key to all of this. And while one number really puts this into perspective, in the US today, 80% of public school teachers are white. At the same time, more than half of all students are students of color. That difference alone can create a huge cultural gap in the classroom. For decades, researchers have been pointing out that this cultural gap can have real consequences. They found that schools often, without even meaning to, treat cultural differences not as strengths but as problems, as barriers to learning. And it's that deficit mindset that really got scholars thinking, hey, there's got to be a better way. So what's the solution? Well, it falls under this big umbrella idea called asset-based pedagogies. And honestly, the name says it all. It's about a massive shift in thinking. You stop focusing on what you think students are missing, and you start building on the incredible strengths, experiences, and cultural knowledge they walk in the door with. Now, this wasn't just one idea that popped up overnight. It's really been an evolution of thought. Different researchers have built on this concept over time. So let's break down some of the key terms and see how they all connect. Okay, first things first, let's define culture. We're not just talking about food and holidays here. It goes so much deeper. Culture is the lens through which our students see the world. It's their values, their communication styles, their ways of thinking. You could almost say it's the operating system they use to process everything. I love this quote from the educator Emily Stile because it just nails it. Half the curriculum walks in the door with the students. What she means is that a student's background isn't some separate thing from their education. It is a vital part of the curriculum that teachers can and should tap into. The person who really got the ball rolling on this was a scholar named Gloria Ladson-Billings back in the 1990s. She was just tired of hearing this story that Black children were somehow failing. So she decided to completely flip the script. She went out and studied what was right with them and what their most successful teachers were doing differently. And what came out of her research was this powerful framework she called culturally relevant pedagogy. And look, this wasn't about making kids feel good for a moment. It was a serious, rigorous model designed to do three things: help them succeed academically, make them feel proud of who they are, and teach them how to analyze and question the world around them. She breaks it down into these three essential pillars. First, a relentless focus on student learning and achievement. Second, what she calls cultural competence, being grounded in your own culture while also learning to appreciate and navigate others. And third, developing a critical consciousness, which is just a way of saying you learn to see, understand, and question injustice in society. Okay, so the conversation didn't stop there. It kept evolving. A few years later, in 2000, another scholar, Geneva Gay, built on this foundation and coined the term we hear a lot today, culturally responsive teaching. Her big contribution was really focusing on the how, the practical ways you can use a student's culture as a tool for teaching. So, Gay laid out these 5 essentials. It means teachers need to have a real knowledge base about different cultures. The curriculum itself needs to be relevant. You have to have genuinely high expectations for every single student. And, crucially, it's about appreciating that people communicate differently and using examples from all kinds of cultures to teach new things. Okay, so that's all the theory. But what does this actually look like when the school bell rings? Let's move from the academic ideas to some real, concrete examples you might actually see in a school. It can be something as simple as making sure your classroom library has books where every kid can see someone who looks like them. It's about talking about the amazing achievements of scientists, artists, and leaders from all different backgrounds. It's teaching a historical event, but from more than just one perspective. It's even something as subtle as understanding that in some cultures, talking while someone else is talking is a sign of being engaged, not a sign of disrespect. Let me give you a fantastic example of this in action. There was a 5th grade teacher, Teddy Beam Conroy, who was teaching the Declaration of Independence. When her class got to that famous line, "All men are created equal," she just paused and asked them, who were the men who were considered equal at that point? And just that one question opened up this incredible conversation about history and fairness and power. That's critical consciousness right there. So, as this approach has become more mainstream, it's also gotten tangled up in a lot of confusion and, frankly, political drama. So let's take a minute and just clear the air about what this is and what it absolutely is not. There is this brilliant analogy from Zaretta Hammond, who is an expert in this field. She says, trying to understand this concept from the headlines is like that old story of the blind men and the elephant. Everyone grabs one part, like just the diverse books, and thinks they understand the whole thing, but they're missing the big picture. They see the surface stuff, but miss the deep shift in how a teacher actually teaches. And here's another huge one people get wrong. This is not about treating students of color as if they're all defined by trauma. That's literally the opposite of the entire point. Remember, it's an asset-based model. That means you start with what's strong and brilliant about a student, not with a guess about what might be broken. And now for the big one, culturally responsive teaching gets confused with critical race theory all the time, but they are very different things. As you can see here, responsive teaching is a pedagogy. It's a how-to for teaching in a classroom. Critical race theory is a high-level academic framework born out of legal studies that's used to analyze how racism is built into systems. They might both touch on equity, sure, but their goals, their origins, and how they're used are completely different. In fact, Gloria Ladson-Billings, the woman who pioneered this whole field, has said it herself very clearly. She states that her work has nothing to do with critical race theory. She points out that people who are against it have just kind of lumped everything together without looking at the important differences. So after all the definitions and the debates and the distinctions, let's get back to the most important question. Why does any of this matter? What's the real goal of bringing a student's culture into the classroom? And this is maybe the most important takeaway. This is for all students. This isn't just for students of color. An educator named Sharoki Hawley talks about the rings of culture every single child brings with them, their background, their language, whether they're from the city or the country. This way of teaching helps white kids from poor rural areas just as much as it helps anyone else, because it values their unique experience too. At the end of the day, it really comes down to this. It's about seeing every single student's background, not as some extra thing you have to deal with, but as the actual thread you use to weave the fabric of learning. Their culture becomes the raw material for building new knowledge, and that makes learning more powerful and more effective for everybody. So I want to leave you with this one last question to think about. What would really change in our schools if we made this shift? What if every single classroom in the country saw students' culture not as an obstacle to be overcome, but as the absolute key to unlocking their greatest potential?